In 2012, the Chinese government made a decision that, on paper, looked like progress. They would relocate thousands of wild animals, deer, wild boar, pheasants, and more, into a single protected reserve in Shaanxi province. The goal was simple: rebuild what decades of hunting and deforestation had destroyed, restore the land, bring back the wildlife. It sounded like a conservation success story, the kind of thing that wins international awards, and for the first 2 years, it was. But by 2015, something started shifting in the forests. Farmers living near the reserve began reporting strange things: crops destroyed overnight, livestock missing, entire fields wiped out before sunrise. At first, local officials blamed it on weather, then on poor farming practices. But the farmers knew better. They had lived on that land for generations. They had never seen anything like this. And then the reports started coming in from deeper inside the reserve. The animal population hadn't just recovered, it had exploded, and the ecosystem that was supposed to be saved was beginning to collapse from the inside. The Qinling Mountains stretch across central China like a spine: dense forests, deep valleys, rivers that have run for thousands of years. It was here, in the heart of Shaanxi province, that the government chose to act. The plan was backed by China's State Forestry Administration. Official documents called it a wildlife density restoration program. The goal was to reintroduce native species into areas where they had gone locally extinct: deer, roe deer, wild boar, pheasants, river otters. Thousands of animals transported in from breeding centers and wildlife farms across 4 different provinces. Some came from as far as Yunnan. Others were bred in captivity and had never once touched wild soil. They were released in batches between 2012 and 2014, and the early results looked remarkable. Camera traps showed herds of deer grazing freely, boar populations establishing territories within months. Government reports declared the program a model for conservation across Asia. International environmental groups praised it publicly. But there was one detail buried deep in the internal reports. One detail nobody talked about in the press releases. The animals weren't just released into the wild. They were released into a zone that had been fenced. A large zone, nearly 400 square kilometers, but still enclosed. The predators that once kept these populations in check had never been reintroduced. No wolves, no leopards, just prey animals, thousands of them, multiplying without limit, and nobody, at least not publicly, seemed to think that was a problem, until the summer of 2015, when a park ranger named Wei Guohua walked into Sector 7 of the reserve and found something that made him stop completely. Wei Guohua had been a park ranger for 11 years. He had seen drought, he had seen floods, he had seen disease move through a forest like smoke. But Sector 7 stopped him cold. The vegetation was gone. Not thinned, not damaged. Gone. An area roughly the size of 40 football fields had been stripped bare. Tree bark chewed down to raw wood. Shrubs pulled out by the roots. The ground itself looked trampled, packed hard like concrete from thousands of hooves moving over it again and again. Wei pulled out his field notebook and started counting tracks. Deer tracks. Everywhere. Overlapping, layered, fresh ones on top of old ones. He radioed back to the main station. His supervisor told him not to overreact. Animals move around, he said. That's normal. But Wei had walked this sector every month for 3 years. This was not normal. He submitted a formal report the following week. It sat on a desk in Xi'an for 6 weeks before anyone responded. When they did, the response was short. Continue monitoring. No action required at this time. Wei continued monitoring, and what he documented over the next 4 months was staggering. The deer population in the reserve had grown past all projections. The original estimate was around 3,000 animals across the full zone. By late 2015, internal counts suggested the number was closer to 11,000, nearly 4 times the land's natural carrying capacity, and still no predators. But here is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. The damage wasn't staying inside the fence. The fence was supposed to be the solution. 400 kilometers of reinforced wire mesh, steel posts driven 2 meters into the ground, built to keep the animals in and the outside world out. but nobody had accounted for 11,000 desperate, hungry animals pushing against it every single night. By early 2016, sections of the fence had begun to fail. Not dramatically, not all at once. Small breaks, gaps at the base where boar had rooted underneath, spots where deer had pressed through in groups, bending the wire slowly over weeks. And through those gaps, animals poured out. Not in a flood, quietly, steadily, like water finding cracks in a dam. The village of Liujiaping sat 4 kilometers from the reserve's eastern boundary. Around 200 farming families had lived there for generations. They grew corn, wheat, and sweet potato on terraced hillside fields. In March 2016, a farmer named Chen Baolin walked out at dawn to check his fields. He stood at the edge and didn't move for a long time. His entire upper terrace, gone. Corn stalks snapped at the base, soil churned, tracks everywhere. He called his neighbor, then another, 3 families. Same story, same morning. By April, it wasn't 3 families, it was 30. Local government officials arrived, took photographs, and promised compensation. But the compensation was slow, and the animals kept coming back, every night, without fail. Because inside the reserve, there was nothing left to eat. They weren't invading, they were starving. And that's when the ecological data from inside the reserve finally leaked to the press. What it showed changed everything. The data had been compiled by a team of ecologists from Northwest University in Xi'an. They had been quietly studying the reserve since 2014. Their findings were never meant to go public, but a junior researcher handed the full report to a journalist from Qinling media, and once it was out, it couldn't be taken back. The numbers were stark. Inside the reserve, native ground vegetation had dropped by 73%. Soil erosion had accelerated to levels not seen in the region for over a century. 3 species of ground-nesting birds had completely disappeared from the zone. River sedimentation in 2 nearby tributaries had increased dramatically because the roots holding the hillside soil together were gone, eaten, stripped, destroyed. The reserve hadn't been restored. It had been quietly turning into a wasteland, and the animals themselves were suffering. Carcasses found inside the fence showed clear signs of malnutrition. Deer with visible rib cages, boar with stunted growth. A population that looked large on paper was quietly dying from the inside. One ecologist, Dr. Zhang Peng, gave a single interview before going silent. He said something that hit hard. He said, "We created the pressure without creating the release valve. No predators, no population control, no exit. Just thousands of animals consuming a closed system until it broke." The government's response came swiftly after the report went viral. They announced an emergency review. They promised corrective action, but what they actually decided to do next, nobody saw it coming. Not the farmers, not the ecologists, not even Wei Guohua. The government's decision was not what anyone expected. They didn't reduce the animal population. They didn't reintroduce predators. They expanded the reserve. The fence line was pushed outward by nearly 60 kilometers, absorbing farmland, absorbing village buffer zones. 17 farming families in Liujiaping were relocated, including Chen Baolin. He had farmed that land since he was a boy. His father had farmed it before him. He was given compensation and a resettlement apartment in a nearby town. He accepted it quietly. But before he left, he told a local journalist one thing. He said, "They moved the animals to fix the land. Then they moved us to fix the animals." That line spread across Chinese social media within days. It captured something people couldn't quite articulate before. The intervention hadn't failed because of bad science. It had failed because of incomplete thinking. They solved one problem without asking what came next, and then solved that problem without asking what came after that. By 2019, the expanded reserve began showing early signs of stabilization. Vegetation slowly returning in outer sectors, animal mortality rates dropping. But the ground-nesting birds never came back. The 2 river tributaries still run heavy with sediment, and the hillside above where Liujiaping once stood is still bare. Nature can recover, but it recovers on its own timeline, not on a government schedule, not on a press release. This story is a reminder that good intentions without full understanding can cost more than doing nothing at all. And somewhere in the Qinling Mountains, that lesson is still being written. If this story made you think, you are exactly who this channel is made for. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. These are the stories that do not make headlines, but absolutely should.